Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. I am excited to be here today with Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity. Honestly, I am so excited because we've been interviewing lately on intellectual conservatism, Rob Coons, we had Lloyd A. Newton. So we've been discussing a lot of philosophy of religion issues. And Cameron has kind of been a rising up star in the Christian apologetics world. So I'm excited today to be talking about at least one argument for the existence of God, the contingency argument. But before we actually get into the argument itself, Cameron, can you introduce yourself and your ministry, Capturing Christianity?
Yeah, so Swan, thanks for having me on. I hope I'm saying your name right. Is it Swan?
Yeah, like the bird.
Swan. Okay, easy. All right. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on. And just a little about myself. My name is Cameron Bertuzzi. I was a photographer. I guess I still am a photographer. I was a full-time photographer, and now I'm sort of in the middle of transitioning to full-time ministry with Capturing Christianity. And what we do as a ministry is we provide sort of these educational materials in a bunch of a variety of ways for Christian apologetics, philosophy of religion. So I interview a lot of philosophers, kind of the same thing that you're doing, it seems, here at Intellectual Conservatism. So I have a YouTube channel, website, we post blog posts, and we also have a podcast. So a bunch of different things going on, and my background's in photography. So that's one of the things that sort of sets me apart, is that everything that I do, everything, the way that everything looks is really pretty, basically. So I try to have really cool lighting and basically embrace that side. Because when I was starting my ministry, I was thinking, do I even want to mention the fact that I'm a photographer? Is that going to like lessen, the sort of, are people going to not take me seriously when I mention that I'm a photographer trying to do philosophy or apologetics or whatever? And once I decided I'm just going to embrace who I am, then it sort of started to fall together. So,
and if you don't mind me asking, what philosophy book or apologetics book really got you interested in going down, I don't know, your intellectual inquiry?
Well, the initial thing that set it off was I learned about 7 or 8 years ago, my brother came out as an atheist, and talking with him, that kind of sent me on a journey to discover whether or not Christianity was true, whether there were good reasons to think that God exists, and basically to answer a lot of the objections that he raised during our initial meetings. And that's what sent me on a journey. But I would say the book that sort of did it, On Guard, was one of the initial books that I bought by William Lane Craig. And the reason why I bought that one was because one of the first things that I searched for was evidence for the resurrection, and a lecture by William Lane Craig is the first thing that popped up. And so I listened to that, and then I looked into him a little bit further and found that he had some books written. And so that was the first book that I bought. But I would say that the book that really got me interested in philosophy, more like the more rigorous type of thing that we're discussing today, and other things that I think about and do, would probably be Alvin Plantinga's God, Freedom, and Evil. That book introduced me to what's called analytic philosophy, which is basically just the rigorous type of philosophy where you've got to make sure you're defining things correctly and laying out all the steps in your arguments and analyzing every premise and defending it. That introduced me to the wonderful world of philosophy, and how to really think clearly about issues like this, God and evil and arguments for God's existence. So I would say that book has had a real big impact on me in my philosophical thinking, at least.
Right. And real quick, before we get into the actual argument, two things. One is us classical theists are welcoming you, Cameron, to our side once you get here. The second thing is, I really want to know, did you hear back from Ed Fazer and Graham Oppie about the February debate?
So that's a good question. I've actually dropped the ball on that. I haven't reached out to them. I've had so many things going on, and that's not really even a good excuse, because I've had time to do it. It's just sort of slipped my mind. My focus has been mainly on raising the funds to do full-time ministry, and so that's sort of where I'm at. But I'll reach back out to them. That's a good reminder. I should reach back out and try to follow up and set something up. So it's a good reminder.
All right. Well, let's get into the contingency argument then.
Cool.
So first, what is the contingency argument? And I noticed in your version of it, you kind of divide into two stages. So let's just get first just like a rundown of what the argument precisely is.
All right. So the argument from contingency is classified as a cosmological argument. And I think the reason why it's classified, or why some arguments are classified as cosmological arguments, is because you're looking at the universe on the whole. It's like a big scale type zoom out and look at the whole thing kind of thing. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is called the contingency argument. We're looking at one aspect of the universe as a whole. We're looking at the contingent aspect of it and sort of asking, what can we learn about that? And the reason why it's called the contingency argument, well, as I said, we're looking at the aspect called contingent. And so we're looking at contingent things. Let me go ahead and explain what these terms mean. So a contingent thing is something that can fail to exist. So I have my phone here. This is something that didn't have to exist. No one had to make this phone. It could have just failed to exist. Or I could break it. I could just throw it on the ground. I could smash it with a hammer. It hasn't always been here, and it can go out of existence. So this is an example of a contingent thing. And so what the argument looks at is, well, so we have these facts about our world. Pretty much everything that we come in contact with is a contingent thing. So just look around your room or look around your car. If you're listening to this on your phone, look around at everything. Pretty much everything that you're looking at hasn't been here forever. It's contingent. It could fail to exist. It could go out of existence. It could be destroyed. And this, the idea here is that once you take all of the contingent things together and ask, well, where did all the contingent reality come from? Then we wind at something that is not contingent to explain all of contingent reality. And so that's the basic rundown of this argument. And like you mentioned, I like to split the argument up into two stages. And there was a philosopher that originally did this. And the reason why he did this is because it just helps to keep things clear. And I think he's in the analytic tradition. So he's all about clarity and trying to make sure that we're putting the right objections in the right part of the argument, keeping all of these things separate. So the first part of the argument is really about contingent things and explaining contingent things. Because when you look around, so like I didn't mention this, and I should have explained this first. When you're looking at contingent things, like my phone, for example, I'll pull it back up here. When you look at a contingent thing, something that could fail to exist or didn't have to be here, all of these things have an explanation for why they exist. There's a reason why my phone is here. There's a reason why my mug on my table is here. There's a reason why my computer is here. Everything has some kind of explanation. And so when you combine that, this principle of explanation, with the fact that, well, when you just take the group of all contingent things that exist, there's got to be some explanation for that group of things. And so we wind up at an explanation that is not itself contingent, that is a necessary being. And so that's stage one of the argument. And then stage two is really about tying that feature of reality, this necessary or non-contingent part of reality that we've arrived at in stage one, and we're tying that feature to God somehow. So some people just do, and we're going to get into all of this and explain and look at it in a lot more depth. But there's a few different ways that people do that, and some people go all the way to try to establishing all the divine attributes, omniscience, omnipotence, perfection, and everything. And then some people just try to get to like, well, it's got to be something that's non-physical or non-contingent and has a mind and these sort of generic properties of something that looks kind of like God. But there's a lot of different paths and arguments that people use. So I hope that gives a sort of overview. I mean, we can go through each, because my version of the argument, I have different steps and premises laid out. So if you'd like to go over those, we can.
Yeah, let's hit on maybe some of the more controversial points of the argument. So I have the argument in front of me here. Premise one, right? For any contingent thing or group of things, there's an explanation of the fact it or they exists. So I think that just looking at the first premise, one of the arguments that I've heard people kind of discuss is, well, look, this presupposes the principle of sufficient reason, right? For every contingent fact or thing, there is an explanation of that thing. And I know that, for example, in the Leibnizian cosmological argument, it distinguishes between things that are necessary or have an outside external explanation. Mm-hmm. So maybe as we ease into the argument, one thing we could discuss is really maybe the principle of sufficient reason. So why is it the case that contingent things need an explanation for their existence?
So yeah, I would want to clarify a couple things. So I wouldn't say that you need an explanation. I would just say that that's like a reasonable thing to draw from the evidence. And so, and I'll give some, basically three different reasons why I think that some kind of principle like this is true. But another point of clarification is that premise one is just a version of the principle of sufficient reason. So it's not necessarily assuming a principle. It is a principle, and it's one of the different types of principles. That's another point of clarification there, is that a lot of people will say, well, the PSR or the principle of sufficient reason fails, when in reality there's only principles of sufficient reason. There are different versions, and so some objections to some versions don't work against all of them. And so that's important to keep in mind, because if you have an objection to one version, it might not work against the version that I have or someone else uses. So we've got to keep that in mind as we're analyzing and looking at these different arguments. So on the premise one, the first premise of stage one of my argument, and let me just repeat it for your audience: for any contingent thing or group of things, there is an explanation of the fact it or they exists. And so on stage, or in support of this principle or this premise, I usually cite three different reasons. And so the first one, I think, is that it's just sort of common sense. Like I was mentioning earlier, I was trying to give what's called an intuition pump. So when you look around at pretty much anything in your field of vision, you can ascertain A, that it's a contingent thing, and then B, that that particular thing has some kind of explanation. I mean, I can just look around and start listing things: this computer, this mouse, this table, the camera that I'm recording on, this microphone. All of these things have some kind of explanation. And so it just seems sort of natural to think that everything, or every contingent thing at least, is going to have some kind of explanation. I think that seeking explanations and explanation finding is also something that's central to science. You know, in life, we're constantly looking for explanations. Over the past couple months, I've had some inexplicable pains in my chest and in my back, and I've always been looking for explanations of what is causing all of these different pains. It's never been in my mind that, oh, well, this is just happening for no reason. And so I think that explanation and assuming kind of this embedded, you can call it an intuition if you want, but I think that's just sort of natural. It's commonsensical to think that these sort of events or contingent things, I'm a contingent thing and I have different things going on in me, these have explanations. So it's common sense. I think that's the number one reason. The second reason is we can do something that's called inductive generalization. And so from the fact that we know that things in our contingent things in our experience have explanations, and I've already mentioned a bunch, and I can mention them again, like my mouse or my phone, these have explanations. Everything in our experience as we walk around the world have explanations, and we can generalize this to every contingent thing in the same way that we can generalize over the fact that gravity works in our experience. And so it's pretty safe to assume that gravity is going to work in the Andromeda galaxy or across the universe. We don't have to be skeptical of these things. This just sort of seems natural, and we can use what's called inductive generalization. We use this all the time in science and in everyday thinking. And that's a completely valid inference. Another thing to point out here is that, again, these aren't proving with 100% certainty. That's not what we're looking for. We're not looking to prove with 100% certainty that there's a principle like this that's true. We just want to find some reasons and evidence to convince us. I think that's the standard we need to be looking for, not 100% certainty. So induction, science, we don't deal in certainties in science or in this type of evidence. You're never going to be, even in a court case, 100% certain that you've convicted the killer, even with DNA evidence. DNA evidence can be wrong. It's, there's a 1 in a million chance that it's wrong, but it's still possible that it's wrong. Anyways, so those two reasons: first of all, common sense, and then inductive generalization. And then the last one is, I think, really, really powerful. And it's the fact that our universe is predictable. It's not chaotic. It's actually orderly. Things aren't popping into existence and out of existence all the time. And the question that we want to ask is why? Why is the universe orderly like this? And one very simple answer to this is that contingent things just can't do that. They can't pop into being for no reason, no explanation. There's always got to be some reason or explanation why things happen and where things come from. And so I think that, and that's actually something that can be very, very rigorously defended. There was a book called Necessary Existence written by Josh Rasmussen and Alex Proust, where they give a very rigorous formulation of this type of argument. I think it's extremely powerful. And so for those three reasons, I think that it's pretty safe, not necessarily to assume, but to infer that there is some kind of principle of explanation like this, especially the one that I give, I think is a very reasonable premise.
Yeah, and just to also discuss like what the aim of the argument is, I like how you qualified. It's not to prove that God exists and like, without any shadow of a doubt, but it's just to demonstrate that maybe belief in God is rational, that this seems plausible. And from maybe this seemingly plausible foundation, you can come to see that, okay, well, it seems like it's plausible to also think that God exists. Uh,
Yeah,
so
I think that certainty is in our culture is something that's very overrated. People want certainty about everything, and if you don't have certainty, then you don't have anything. It's kind of like, you know, I just think that's completely flawed. We don't need to have certainty in order to have knowledge or in order to be justified in having the beliefs that we hold. I just think that certainty is a standard that, well, especially once you start to look into philosophy, it's not something that professionals are super worried about. They don't really care to have certainty about much of anything. You can have arguments, you can have reasons, and you can have evidence, and that those are the types of things that are more interesting. And that I think the type of thing that we should be looking for is just having a good, justified, rational, warranted belief that God exists or that Christianity is true. We don't necessarily need certainty like that. That is just it's overrated.
right. So let's go to premise two of the argument now. So
Yep.
premise two says, considering all the contingent things that exist, if there is an explanation for those things, then there is a necessary part of reality. So, I mean,
Yep.
one thing I could do is I could just kind of like nitpick at maybe the wording, right? Like a part of reality, right?
Yeah.
Like, but then that kind of, that's what analytic philosophers do. It gets a little annoying. Let's just get to the basics, right? But I think what this premise is basically saying is, look, here are all these contingent things that require an explanation, right? And you already offered a defense of why an explanation seems to be uh, necessary or demanded it, let's say. And then you're eventually saying, look, there has to be a point at which these explanations stop, and it has to be something necessary, not something that's contingent like everything else that could fail to exist.
I don't know that I'm saying that. I don't know that I'm saying there's got to be a point where they stop. I think I think premise two is really just about looking at the group of contingent things taken as a whole. Because if you look back at premise one, it says for any contingent thing or group of things. So it's not just individual contingent things like this phone, but the entire group of items on my desk, for example, the entire group has an explanation as well. And the explanation might be in terms of the individual explanations of each individual thing. But every group of thing has an explanation as well. And those, like I said, those explanations might be complex or even simple, depending on what that group consists of. But the point here is that if premise one is true, then any group of contingent things is going to have an explanation. And so all we simply do at this point is take the group of all contingent things. And if premise one is true, then it applies to all contingent things taken as a group or taken as a whole. Or take it, you don't even have to say that it's one thing over and above the parts either. You can use the terminology of a plurality of things, and there's still got to be an explanation of that plurality.
Mm.
And so we can take that set or that group or that plurality of all contingent things. And again, if premise one is true, there has to be an explanation of that group. And the only type of explanation that could work here is something that is non-contingent, because otherwise you're explaining all contingent reality in terms of a contingent thing, but that contingent thing is already included in the group and things can't explain themselves. So you've got to look for an explanation that's outside of the group. You've got to look for something that is necessary or non-contingent. So I think that we're on pretty good solid premise two, especially if premise one is true, that premise two is fairly certain.
All right. So I'm starting to see like the subtle difference between what I was interpreting and what you were arguing, right?
Mm.
So it's not necessarily like, okay, so we can go back and we, there's an infinite regress. Not necessarily like that. What you're arguing is more like, look, if you really take the idea seriously that contingent things and even a group of contingent things have an explanation, then you can't just say, oh, the explanation is contingent because that's already part of the group itself that requires an explanation.
Right.
So
And
it
things
must be
don't explain
non-contingent.
themselves. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So then um, let me see here.
And
I
then
think we,
and then the third premise, or
yeah.
not the premise, but the conclusion from those two premises follows. There's a necessary part of reality. Yeah, and I'm not a super big fan of that terminology either. But the reason why I chose that was it was for a popular audience. The original audience that I shared this argument with, it was on Unbelievable, where I was doing a debate with an atheist, and so I wanted to use some terminology, some language that was relatively easy to understand, and so we could definitely get more rigorous or
Hmm.
philosophical with the language there. But yeah.
Right. And just to also clarify, um, has anyone ever tried to argue, well, non-contingent doesn't necessarily mean necessary? Like, is that a possibility, or is it just accepted that there are contingent and necessary things?
uh no, no one's argued that. In what I would say in response to that is just to say that these are just the way that we're defining our terms in the
Hmm.
argument. So a non-contingent thing would just be a necessary thing.
All right,
So
cool. So let me also kind of maybe pose just like an objection right here, if you don't
okay,
mind. So
sure.
one of the questions that I could see someone asking is, well, look, let's accept for the sake of argument that there are contingent things, right? So in our common experience, we seem to see things that could fail to exist, but we've never seen something necessary. We've never really experienced it. So how can we really trust, let's say, our intuition on this? Or, maybe someone says, I trust my intuition more that there are contingent things over the fact that there is something necessary. What would you say in response to that?
Repeat the question again for me. What was the first part of
Right.
it?
So the question would be, my intuition about contingent things is strong because
Mhm.
experience, but I've never experienced anything that is necessary. So how can I posit this necessary being or part of reality?
Gotcha. So I guess there I would just say that we don't have to personally experience something in order to know that it exists. We can go back to the analogy that I gave earlier of gravity. Like we can know that gravity works on Andromeda, even though we've never been to the Andromeda galaxy personally. So I would just say that that's that kind of standard of we've got to experience this in order to say that it's real or that it exists, I think is a completely false standard. And in science, we don't have to experience much of anything to have scientific knowledge about the past or the world. For example, the Big Bang. One of the reasons why people believe that the Big Bang happened was because of this thing called redshift in the stars and the fact that the galaxies seem to be expanding or moving away from us at a very high velocity. So we can infer from this fact that we can see our observations that there was this event that happened 13.7 billion years ago or however long it was ago, and we don't have to experience the Big Bang in order to infer from our own observations. So and again, this is an argument for a conclusion, and so what you've got to do is interact with the argument. You've got to interact with the premises, and you've got to find, because we're using deductive logic here, and so as long as you accept logic, then you've got to interact with the argument, interact with the premises, determine which of the premises you think that your objection is targeting. So if it's not targeting premise one, if it's not targeting premise two, then the conclusion just sort of follows from those two premises. So I guess I've said kind of three things there, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to make sense because someone who raises that kind of question, I don't think necessarily um, they're kind of questioning just like how we are making these assertions, if you will. So that, I mean, that could be a kind of engaging the argument on a meta level, but not actually maybe hitting directly at some premise, or it could be. Um,
Yeah, I think that we can use our own observations to make inferences, I think. And I think we can do this in a very safe way. For example, we can know based on our experience of humans, of other humans, that all humans are mortal, even though we don't have full experience of every single human that's ever lived,
Hmm.
or even the humans that are alive on the planet right now, we don't have a complete set of experiences of every single human. Yet we can infer based on our own experience of ourselves and the people around us that humans are mortal. And so I think that we can draw really reasonable inferences from our observations without having to experience everything.
I'm
Yeah,
also
there's
interested. Oh,
more to say
sorry.
there too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
go ahead.
Well, I was also interested in the metaphysics of contingent and necessary things. So, for example, if you don't mind me getting a little analytical here, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, with contingent beings, right? Like one question we could ask ourselves is what makes them have this property of being contingent, right?
Hmm.
Where does that contingent property come from? And then we can also ask about a necessary being, right? Like how does that work, if you will? I remember
Hmm.
listening to a Josh Rasmussen on your page discussing the contingency argument, and I remember he said he began using the language of act and potency. And I mean, we don't have to dive into this too deeply, but I was wondering if, how would you go about explaining the contingent properties of things, how we can know that things have contingent properties, and necessary properties, what they are, and how we know that things have necessary existence, if you will.
How we know that things have necessary existence. That's a really good question that I don't really have a good answer to. So, I mean, I'm not really sure how to where to go from here. Maybe, I mean, we can just sort of think about this together. So
Hmm.
let me just wind up or rewind a second and get clear on your question. So you're
Yeah.
asking how we can know that, for example, let me just give an example here that this cup is contingent. Right? Is that the question that you're asking?
Yeah, something like that. Also, I'm muting the microphone because the garage is opening and closing.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, no worries. Um, so I think that in one of the ways that we can one of the things that we can do is just to look at something and just we can know just by looking at it. And this would be we'd be getting into epistemology here. I would say that this I can know that this is a contingent thing just by looking at it. And what that will classify as is a properly basic belief.
Hmm.
So that's one way I think that we could justify it. But another way would be that I could just go and break this thing. Like I could just go and throw it on the ground and test that properly basic belief.
Hmm.
And if it breaks, then it's a contingent thing.
Or let
Um,
me try to be more precise in my question.
okay.
What makes it contingent, if you will?
What makes it contingent? Okay. Um, that's there's still some ambiguity there
Yeah.
because in what we've done at the beginning of the interview here was we just sort of defined what we mean by a contingent thing. And a contingent
Hmm.
thing just is something that can fail to exist or go out of existence or didn't always have to be here.
Yeah.
And so that's how we're defining the thing. And then we can just sort of look around and say, well, where does this thing classify? Is it a necessary thing or is it a contingent thing? And when
Hmm.
I look at this cup, it seems to classify as a contingent thing in the way that I've defined it. It doesn't seem like it's the type of thing that's been here forever, right? And I know that I ordered a mug like this and it came to my house. I know that it hasn't sort of been around forever. So I guess that's something else that I would say. Does that answer your question at all?
Yeah, and I should also explain like the reason why I'm going down this line of questioning, so it doesn't seem like I'm just splitting hairs, right? Because there is a question that I'm sure like many people would wonder about when it comes to the metaphysics of the concepts that we're talking about. So someone could say, well, okay, how do we know that being saying that something is contingent is just a convention of ours rather than something that really is a part of reality that should be explained, or you know uh, forgive any terminology that I get wrong there. Uh, I was thinking kind of, and the reason why I brought up Josh Rasmussen as well is
Hmm.
because I just noticed that there's kind of like kind of an Aristotelian underpinning to this argument, with the phaser type of act potency arguments that he makes. So, for example, if I had to give an answer to why, like, what makes a contingent thing contingent or possibly fail to exist, I would say the first thing is it's a composite, right? And I think this is the Augustinian argument,
Mm.
for Augustinian proof in Phaser's book.
I think
where
Kuhn's would agree with that too.
yeah, like things are composed of parts, right? And they require an explanation for why the parts are combined the way they are.
Hmm.
And then if they require parts to be together to have an actual existence, then you could conceive of the parts being separate. And without that unity, there wouldn't be existence of that particular substance or thing. Another would be the act potency distinction. So in Aristotelianism, there's this concept of prime matter, where if you think about like a lump of clay, right? A lump of clay is full of potentials to become something. And it takes an artist to sculpt and make a form for it to actually be a substance. So all things kind of came from prime matter. Their potency is actualized, or prime matter's potency is actualized by form to become something. So it's always conceivable that that potential to go back to prime matter is still there. I mean, so that's just me kind of going in a circle, but I was just interested in exploring the deeper metaphysical picture that's here, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, my familiarity with Aristotelian metaphysics, Thomistic metaphysics, is pretty slim. So unfortunately, I can't pontificate a whole lot or join in with the conversation a whole lot with you there. So sorry
No,
about
it's
that.
okay. It's just kind of like a interesting line of inquiry.
Yeah.
Before we continue, too, if you don't mind me asking, um, I generally tend to notice that um, arguments for the existence of God, such as the contingency argument, uh, especially after not necessarily explicitly part of the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, right? They tend to just say, "All right, here are just general facts that seem plausible," right?
Hmm.
They don't try to begin with a whole comprehensive metaphysical theory. And I wonder, do you find that to like what strengths are there, what weaknesses are there in that
Yeah.
approach?
Yeah. I think one of the obvious strengths is that you have less things that you've got to prove, and as obvious or as strong as you think a Thomistic metaphysic is, and especially when you read someone like Ed Feser, you see pretty quickly that there's a lot of good reasons to adopt that kind of metaphysic. Um, I I think that when you have an argument that has less assumptions, it's just going to be easier in the long run to sort of level with someone and share it with them and possibly even win them over.
Hmm.
So I think that's an obvious strength of an argument that has less assumptions, and that's a little bit simpler in that regard, where you don't have to have all of the additional sort of metaphysical baggage, if you want to use that term. I think Ed Feser, even in his new book Five Proofs for the Existence of God, I think he does adopts a similar strategy. So he has some of the Aristotelian underpinnings, but he doesn't go all the way necessarily all the
Yeah.
time.
Hmm.
Yeah. So I think that there are some pretty obvious benefits of using an argument that doesn't have all of the assumptions or doesn't require them, at least. People are doing that all the time with arguments. There's William Lane Craig. He endorses a kind of contingency argument, but he uses a sort of weaker explanatory principle than someone like Alexander Pruss, who uses the sort of standard uh, principle of sufficient reason, which goes every contingent fact has an explanation. That's a really strong principle.
Hmm.
So William Lane Craig adopts a much weaker one that just says every contingent thing has an explanation. And so you're not saying that every fact has an explanation. You're just saying that contingent objects or things have an explanation. So I think that finding weaker premises and just sort of lessening the amount of assumptions built into your arguments is in general a good thing.
All right, so let's get to kind of the last few questions about the contingency argument. So I think so far we've kind of had a lot of good clarification about how the argument works, about the premises and the first stage of the argument. I think the second stage is going to be very, very interesting. So the
Okay.
second stage basically says, look, there's a necessary part of reality. That was the conclusion of the first stage of the argument. The second stage says, if there is a necessary part of reality, then God exists. That's the first premise, and we've already established that there is a necessary part of reality, therefore God exists. So how do we get from a necessary part of reality to God?
Yeah, so this is what's called in the literature the gap problem, and we'll probably use that term throughout this section of the interview. So in my studies, I've found basically two overall approaches to the gap problem, overcoming this gap. And so the first one is what I'll call the cumulative case, where basically what you do is you look at additional evidence, you look at additional effects or observations in the world that need some kind of explanation. And you would find that, for example, I'm interviewing a guy tonight on my YouTube channel. His name is Luke Barnes. He's a cosmologist. And we're talking about evidence from fine tuning, that the universe is fine tuned for life. The constants and quantities of the initial conditions of the universe at the very beginning had to be set just right so that the universe could permit the evolution of conscious embodied moral agents like we are. And we can look at evidence like that and sort of compile it all together and say that, well, we have this evidence from contingency, we have the evidence from fine tuning. We could even look at something like the argument from moral knowledge and just sort of add in these additional facts that would get us to some kind of necessary part of reality that is not just necessary, but also personal and moral. So that's one route, and that's a route that a lot of Christian philosophers use. Richard Swinburne is a guy that uses that, and even Alex Proust mentions that in his essay in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. He's got an essay on the Leibnizian cosmological argument, and he mentions that method as well. So that was the first one, the cumulative case. And then the second one is that we could just sort of look deeper at the foundation that we've arrived at in stage one, and just ask the question, well, what additional features of this thing could we deduce from just sort of asking what type of thing this is? And one of the things that I find a lot of that I find has a lot of weight is going back to Dr. Josh Rasmussen's work, is what he's sort of, his overall strategy is to just posit a sort of theory of the foundation, to say that it's an ultimate or supreme or perfect foundation. And this would actually be the simplest account, and it would account for all of the data. And in the long run, it's going to be the sort of best explanation of the necessary part of reality. So those are the kind of two overall approaches. The first one, again, was the cumulative case, where we look at additional evidence. And then the second one was we just sort of look deeper and analyze what sort of properties this necessary foundation or part of reality has. So we can go deeper on either of those.
Yeah. And which approach do you find more convincing?
I don't look at it in terms of either or. I think that we can do both.
Yeah.
So I would say that the most convincing is going to be the combination of the two. So I wouldn't say that one is better than the other, because we don't have to do that. We could just combine them, and that would be the best one.
Yeah. And, so I remember one time you had Josh Rasmussen and Tom Jump on the show together. I remember Tom Jump kept on saying, like, oh, well, the most plausible hypothesis or of equal explanatory scope and strength is pantheistic naturalism or whatever. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but that could be one concern that we have about proposing a theory, right? We could say maybe not just theism or even monotheism is true, not one God, but maybe it's a very different conception of God, or maybe it just shows that there was one creator, but not one God necessarily. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think that if we're going to go this route of comparing two hypotheses, then we've got to actually define what the two hypotheses are. And so when we're looking at something like a naturalistic pantheism, we'd have to actually define what that is and what it means. How much power does this thing have? What other properties does it have? And if these are degreed properties, or if they're measurable, is the terminology that Rob Koons uses. If it has properties that are measurable, for example, if it can create 20 universes, then we can still ask the question, well, what's the explanation of that? Why only 20 universes? Why not 21? Why not a billion universes? Why does it only have that finite degree of power?
Yeah.
And what that sort of entails, and this is something that Josh Rasmussen has helped me see, is that when we degree a property like that, we're sort of limiting its value. And when we have a limit in value, that's another thing that sort of cries out naturally for explanation. So I think that once we start to do this and define our terms and define what these competing theories are, we're going to find that it is going to end up having some type of degreed or measurable property that's still not really going to solve the problem. And so we're just sort of pushing it back a step maybe. And ultimately, I think the best explanation is going to be found in a perfect being that is unlimited, cannot be improved upon. And I just think that that is the most simple, exquisite explanation. Like, it's impossible to find a better one. It literally is impossible to find a better theory.
Yeah, I mean, and what I like about this too is that since we're not trying to prove the existence of God, but we're just saying, hey, it's rational to believe God's
Mhm.
existence. I mean, when you look at maybe the rational structure of the universe, when you take into account not just, well, I think so. From what I see, the contingency argument just establishes there is a necessary being. And then
Yeah.
in the second stage, we can start adding in more arguments to kind of show that this being is what would seem to be God, right?
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
I've got I'm working on a list right now, actually, with another philosopher. His name is Justin Mooney. I'm working on putting a complete as possible list of stage two arguments for God's
Yeah.
existence from the cosmological argument, the family of arguments. And right now I'm at 16 different
Hmm.
arguments that I have right now. And I want to, I'll eventually put this in a blog post and post it up so people can use it as a resource. But that's where I'm at so far. So there's a lot of arguments in the literature, and you can go a variety of different ways. So
Yeah.
it's
I mean, and what I just find so fascinating too is that, I mean, when you really get down to it, belief in God, you know, it can be a very complex debate with all these intricacies, but it
Mhm.
ultimately, I mean, so I think even Graham Oppy recognizes that belief in God is rational. He just doesn't find it, like, what is it, convincing or reasonable necessarily, that you could be a reasonable or rational atheist
Mhm.
nonetheless. I mean, that seems to be kind of the crux of where the debate lies, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would just say, from my perspective, I would, if I didn't find this argument convincing, then I just wouldn't find it convincing. I wouldn't say that it's a good argument. There are some theistic arguments that I'm just not convinced of because I'm not
Hmm.
convinced they're good arguments. But this one is, to me, it's almost inescapable, and that's at least where I'm at currently. That things could change in the future. I might find some objection or hear something that just sort of changes my perspective completely. But up until this point, I just don't really see a way out of the argument. So that's sort of where I'm at.
All right, let's entertain maybe two objections really quick, and then we can wrap up the interview. So
Okay.
the first is, um, someone could ask, doesn't this argument commit the fallacy of composition? Right. So the fallacy of composition is that, well, it looks like the parts of this thing have this certain property. Therefore, we can say the whole thing has this property. So the parts of an elephant could be quite light, but that must obviously mean then the elephant is light. And no, that's not the right way to look at it. So how do you know that you are not committing the fallacy of composition with this argument with respect to contingent things in the universe, and therefore the universe is contingent as well, or whatever?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say is that we've got to be clear when anyone raises an objection like this to one of these arguments, we've got to make sure that you're targeting the right argument, and you're wanting to find the exact premise that you're targeting, and you got to make sure that the person actually made the fallacy. Like, you can't just throw out a fallacy that some other argument that has the same name
Hmm.
commits. You've got to make sure that this particular version of it commits it, and in what way. So I would say that the fallacy in composition just simply doesn't apply to this version, because I'm not saying that the collection of all contingent things composes like a new distinct object. Like, when workers are assembling a camera, once all the parts come together, most people would say we have a new object, we have a new thing, like a camera. But if I
Hmm.
randomly grab a bunch of hard drives off of my desk, I don't have a new object, I just have a bunch of hard drives. And so my argument only requires that we have that latter type of group. We just have a group of things that isn't a new thing. It's a bunch of individual things that we put in a, what I call a plurality, and we say
Mm.
that that plurality has an explanation. So it's not that we're composing
Yeah.
this new group or this new object and saying that the properties of the individual things applied to the group. Like, that's just not happening anywhere in the argument. Another thing I would say is that when it comes to explanation, individuals are not different from groups. So, for example, it would make just as much sense to ask why one camera exists as it does to ask why 10 cameras exists. It's not that once we add enough cameras, we're just going to suddenly not need an explanation of the group or of the plurality of cameras. So there's no difference between individuals pluralities when it comes to explanations. So yeah, I think those are the two things I would
Hmm.
say there.
Yeah, and I mean, so one could even argue that, okay, fine, there is a group of contingent things in this world somewhere, right? We can accept that. And then
Hmm.
someone could say, but the ultimate explanation, if you will, the necessary being or part of reality is the universe itself.
Hmm.
And that's when in stage two, you'd start hammering away and saying, wait a minute, no, the universe, if we're talking about the same thing, doesn't really have the properties that seem to fit the profile, if you will.
Right. Right.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that.
Hmm.
So then let's go to the second question then, which is, what if the universe is eternal and doesn't need an explanation? What if it really is found in the universe itself, all
Hmm.
material reality?
So this is actually kind of similar to the other to the objection you just sort of raised,
Yeah.
which was that the universe is a kind of necessary being, and so that would bring us to stage two. But also notice that this argument doesn't say anything about how long contingent things have been around or how long the universe has been around. It just says that for any contingent thing or group of things, there's an explanation of the fact that it or they exists. And so it doesn't say anything about how long things have been around. You can adopt any view of the age of the universe. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect any premise of my argument. So I would just say that's sort of a red herring. But ultimately, it is going to get us back to the stage two, where we're looking at the foundation of reality and then looking at what sort of properties it has.
And then from there, yeah, you would eventually raise up the different arguments. And also, you said the 16 arguments you're working on with Justin Mooney. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there's a list. I have a list right now of 16 different arguments that I've found in the literature so far, and it's probably going to grow. This is not a comprehensive list yet. We're still working on it. It's a work in progress, but once I have that completed, I'll post it up somewhere, probably just on my blog, I'm sure. And I'm hoping actually to give like a kind of summary of what it looks like, of what each one looks like, and then give a link to the argument, like the full article or whatever it's found in. Some of them are found in books. So that's my plan with that is to eventually post that up somewhere. Yeah.
So let me say maybe just a few last things, and I'll pass it to you, and then you can close, and then we'll end the episode. So one
Okay.
thing that I really appreciate about you, Cameron, and the argument that you've raised, and kind of your approach, is that you're very cautious. You have, I think, epistemic humility. You're very careful about, okay, well, here's what the argument's claiming. Here's how far we can go. You don't try to, I don't know, like have the, what do you call it, mm, the what is it, a clickbait. You don't have like this clickbait title like, oh, epic proof for the existence of God, atheist gets destroyed by facts and logic. You're like, well, here's the thing, this seems like a pretty plausible argument, and you admit that, okay, I'm still working on bits here and there. So that's just something really great to hear from. And the second thing I'm going to say too is, I remember something that kind of helped me personally as a Christian. I did have a period of time where I did lose my faith and I became agnostic.
Hmm.
One thing that kind of helped me get back to Christianity, or at least accepting theism again as a possible reality, is kind of acknowledging how weird reality is,
Hmm.
right? So I remember like on Ravi Zacharias's YouTube channel, I think he has there's this video where it's kind of explained, or by Vince Vitale, that really, if you think about it, like under Christianity or theism, there's an ultimate explanation that is necessary, has no further explanation. That is personal. Under atheism, you might either have no explanation at all, or you have an explanation that isn't personal. Like regardless, all three of these options are just really weird the more
Hmm.
you think about them.
Hmm.
So that kind of opened me up to seeing that, okay, maybe I don't need a knockdown argument for God. Is it rational? Does this make sense in my life? These are the different questions that I started asking. And that kind of made me realize, okay, if my threshold for belief is going to be like 100% certainty or even 99% certainty, maybe that's too much. But seeing at least that it's a possibility, that it's rational, and that there are other arguments to consider, really opened me up again. So Cameron, I'll give it to you, and then we'll end the episode for there.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate your comments there. I try to do my best in being as objective as possible with these arguments. We all have biases. I mean, I do want God to exist. I've sort of grown up being a Christian, but there was several years where I was sort of wanting to put all of that aside and just be like, apart from how I grew up and what I want, does this actually make sense of reality? Is this stuff true? And ultimately, that's what I want. Ultimately, is truth. So I think we can have a variety of different desires. And so on one level, we do want God to exist, or at least in my case, I do want God to exist. But I think a deeper desire is that I want truth, and I'm ready and willing to give up any belief that doesn't align with the truth, because ultimately I think that's what I want. I don't want to be just convincing myself of something that isn't real. And that's not an easy thing to do, but it is something that's also biblical. Like even in First Corinthians, Paul will say that if all we have are hopes and dreams, so to speak, then we're above all men to be pitied. So I think that it's really important that we don't just search for what's going to comfort us or what we've always grew up believing. I think what we need to do is really search and strive for the truth. And so when we do that, it requires us to look at these arguments as objectively as possible, so that we're not just trying to shore up something that we've already believed or want to believe, but we're actually looking at it from an objective standpoint. So that's one of the things that sort of drives me to look at these arguments as objectively as possible. I'm not 100% perfect at that. Nobody is, but that's sort of what's driving that there. So I really appreciate that. And then, yeah, I mean, I've had my own, I wouldn't call myself an agnostic at any point, but there were several points where I was like, I don't really know, if any of these arguments really work. And then once I found Josh Rasmussen's work and started to dig in there, I was sort of pulled out of that and saw that, hey, well, wait a second. There actually are really, really good, strong reasons that I don't really see. And as I've looked into the literature, there's not really good responses to it. So that's where I'm at currently. And I think that there's really good arguments, really good evidence for the truth of Christianity in particular. One last thing that I wanted to mention is that if you are the type of person who's sort of there where you're like 50-50, I don't know either way, there's a good book that I want you to pick up and read. It's called Taking Pascal's Wager by Michael Rhoda. I interviewed him on my podcast. I did a 2-part series where he basically updates Pascal's wager and argues that if you're 50-50 that Christianity is true, it's not just like a 1% chance, or it's not an equal chance that Christianity and Islam and Hinduism and Buddhism, you can't have an equal chance of all these religions. You have to have a 50-50 chance that Christianity is true or that Christianity is false. But if you're there, then you ought to commit to living a Christian life. And so you don't have to, as you said, Swan, you don't have to have 100% certainty in order to at least commit to live a Christian life and to read your Bible and even pray. And you don't even have to believe all of this stuff yet. You can at least commit to God. And I think eventually along the way, you're going to find God. God is going to meet you there. But that's a book that I would recommend if you're there, if you're on the 50-50 mark and you're kind of contemplating whether to jump in with both feet into Christianity. Pick up that book, give it a read. It's an amazing book. He has it's like broken into 3 parts, and it's really, really cool. My interview with him was awesome. I loved it. So I guess that's what I would leave people with. If you want to find out more about me and the work that I'm doing, visit capturingchristianity.com. I have a Facebook page, I have a Twitter account, Instagram as well. And then the number one place where I'm putting all of my content and putting all of my work is on YouTube. So youtube.com/capturingchristianity. Just search for Capturing Christianity on YouTube. You can find it that way as well. And yeah, thanks for having me on again. And it's been really cool.
All right. Thank you, Cameron. So let me see here. Apologies for the background. I'm a college student, so it's just kind of been like a little messy.
I don't even hear anything, so.
Okay. Well, no, I mean like the appearance of the background, like got pens and yarn and blankets. So sorry about that. Yeah.
No worries at all.
But thank you so much, Cameron.
Yeah. Awesome.